from. It is my absolute pleasure to have you along on the second of our webinar series. So I'm Ritika, excited to be here as the Director of UK Operations. As Cultural Intelligence Centre's first subsidiary employee, I oversee everything for our UK operations, from development to delivery and pretty much everything else in between. With so much going on, it does feel like a lot longer than the 2 months I've officially been on this role. Now, before we jump into the real thing, I'm just going to go through some logistics, if that's okay. Please feel free to add any comments in the chat at any point.
Ritika, you're muted.
I'm sorry, Tasha, where did that leave off? In the logistics? Yeah. Okay. So logistics wise, just feel free to comment on the chat and the questions via the Q&A tab. If we cannot answer them now, we will try and email a response. You're automatically muted, just as I think I was a minute ago, sorry about that, and your cameras are off. The webinar will be recorded and available to share or view through our website. So what are we going to cover in the next hour? This is indeed a very special webinar for us, and a record number of people have registered for it, which just goes to show how important the topics that we are covering today really are. We have Dave Livermore, the founder of the Cultural Intelligence Centre, and we also have a very special guest, Marsha Ramroop, the very first Director of Inclusion at the Royal Institute of British Architects. RIBA is what we're going to refer during the webinar. Marsha will share how she's building her diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy from the ground up. She will give you an inside look at how RIBA is implementing CQ foundationally and practically with more than 55,000 members around the world. Following Marsha's presentation, Dave will ask her some very pertinent and interesting questions. I will then get the opportunity to grill them both before we open the floor to the audience and your questions. Now, before I hand over the mic to Marsha, I just want to say we have 2 special announcements at the end of the webinar, so please stay on. Thank you very much, and Marsha, over and out to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ritika. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. Let me know when that's live. Hopefully you can see it shortly. Great, perfect. So, as Ritika says, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Before I start talking about the strategy and the model, which we've written into a white paper and is going to be available for you, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for turning up, for being engaged in this area. Thank you for clearly wanting to make a difference, to create real change. And thank you for listening to what I've got to say on this matter of equity, diversity, and inclusion, using CQ as a foundational piece. And for clarity, I will shorten equity, diversity, and inclusion to EDI, which is the preferred British acronym. Just stop to share for a second. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I have been more nervous today speaking to you than I have been for quite some time about this presentation. And I was reflecting, why is that? And I realized...
Marsha, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but a number of people are saying they're having a hard time hearing you. So if we could just get your radio voice a bit louder. My apologies, everyone, for the interruption. Just as Marsha was telling us, she was daunted by doing this.
How are you doing? Can you hear me more clearly now?
That's yes, thank you so much. I will quit interrupting you now.
That's okay. Dave, you know, you and I, we can do this to each other.
Absolutely.
So just to reiterate that I'm going to use EDI as the acronym for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, which is the preferred British acronym. And I was just saying that I'm actually more nervous today speaking to you than I have been before any other presentation that I've done, and I do them all the time. And I was reflecting, why is that? And I realized that being able to share these ideas with you is a real example of privilege. The privilege of having this kind of platform of this size to share these ideas is unusual for me. And the privilege of being able to use my voice for those voices that are unheard is my personal mission and purpose. And as such, I really didn't wish to take such an opportunity for granted. And I really don't want to waste it. So I won't pull my punches, which, given that's an idiom, I will use my CQ and explain that I mean to say I will be quite blunt, I'll be quite direct with what I have to say. So you not only understand the real opportunity there is here for real change, but the part that you must play in delivering it. Now, clearly, one of the reasons why you're here is that you want to know how. How do you move forward when you know that you want to be better at EDI and you're trying stuff, but you're not really creating that sustained and sustainable change that you'd like? How? How do you take personal responsibility, and how do you guide your organization forward? Now, Amanda Gorman, in the poem that she wrote for the inauguration of US President Joe Biden, The Hill We Climb, she asked the question, when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? Well, dare I suggest it? This is the question that the Inclusive Culture Pyramid seeks to address. The Cultural Intelligence Center research confirms that having a mix of people in an organization isn't enough to create better outcomes. You need an inclusive culture too. Of course, it's not only the right thing to do to treat other humans well, not just the ones who are like ourselves, but the benefits are tangible, and a better, more equitable society would be a joy for us all to live in. But in addition, the statistics show that inclusive leaders make employees feel 84% more motivated. Organizations with inclusive culture are 8 times more likely to have overall better business outcomes, 6 times more likely to be innovative, twice as likely more to exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing. And it goes on. And implementing the inclusive culture pyramid into an organization to drive effective EDI outcomes is quite straightforward to describe. First, we build a solid foundation where CQ is a stepping stone to an intersectional approach to leading inclusion and effectively managing diversity. CQ serves as a behavioral model, if you like, for individuals and teams. It has to start with the most senior leadership to ultimately inform all the actions in an organization. And concurrently, to create equitable outcomes, the inclusive behaviors need to be embedded as a change strategy into the organization. And I've identified the McKinsey influence model as being particularly useful and successful. And I'll be sharing the slides on this in just a moment. This needs to be implemented for individuals, cascaded to teams, departments, and fed into the organization overall. And to bring about sustained and sustainable inclusive change, you need to apply this new way of thinking and working across all 4 areas of the business. So how you attract people into your organization, how you treat and progress your staff, how you create the services and products of your business, and how you engage your users, customers, clients, audience, members, whoever you're outreaching to. And I like to say that conceptually, you can imagine this approach. What I'm describing is easy to visualize. And I like to ask you to envisage it like a bag of sand. But when you rip open a bag of sand, it's a very granular, very detailed piece of work to do. So one grain of sand might be a menopause policy, another might be setting up staff networks, another might be ensuring you have a robust whistleblowing policy, another could be ensuring you have easy access to your workplace for those with physical needs, and on it goes. But there are some big pieces we can put in place, and CQ behaviours are foundational. But they have to stay in place and be constantly pushed back into position. Otherwise, all the other pieces will fall apart. Now, I will explain specifically how I'm implementing this at the RIBA a little bit later on in this webinar, but I'd like to make a very important point, that it's really important to have support to help your staff implement their CQ learning. Now, I've brought in specific transfer of learning into action coaching to assist with this at the RIBA, and a bit more detail on that later. But let me talk to you about the model that I've described in a very high-level way. CQ, cultural intelligence. Q stands for quotient, as it's a measure as well as a skill. It's the capability to work and relate effectively, I like to say, with people who are different from you. And when applied properly, it forces us to consciously and deliberately challenge ourselves and the perspectives that we're taking and the systems we're succumbing to that allow discrimination to happen in the first place. This behavioural change piece is how we break the cycle of our bias, supporting the systems which perpetuate in society, which reinforce our bias, and very little changing, which leads to diversity fatigue. And I know, even as you listen to this, it might even be rearing its head. So how do we move forward? Sorry, apologies. CQ is comprised of 4 capabilities: CQ drive, CQ knowledge, CQ strategy, and CQ action. And these 4 capabilities were discovered when researchers asked the question, what's the difference between those that succeed in today's multicultural, globalized world and those that fail? Essentially, what's the difference between success and failure when we're working with those who are different from us? And the outcome of questioning across the world, tens of thousands of participants, was a high degree of these 4 attributes. And it starts with wanting to. Do you actually want to work and relate with those who are different from you? CQ drive. And when you don't want to, how do you motivate yourself to do the work required? Now, CQ drive, like all the CQ capabilities, have subcategories to help pinpoint the areas that need work. The subcategories here are intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and self-efficacy. Now, those intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, deriving enjoyment from the task itself, of interacting, supporting, enhancing the lives of those different from you, or gaining reward for, or fearing repercussions of not doing so. You know, that's fairly straightforward to understand. But I want to spend a moment emphasizing self-efficacy here. So much of our ability to be effective at doing better around EDI is tied up in fear. Fear can be paralyzing for some. Fear of cancel culture, fear of doing the wrong thing. Now, I've stopped saying that you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Instead, I think it's more useful to consider leaning into your discomfort. Recognize it, be conscious about it, see it as a conscious opportunity to learn and to grow. We will get things wrong. We always do. It's a human reaction. It's human nature. However, how we react to our mistakes is a mark of high CQ and high self-efficacy. We must listen to those telling us that we've got it wrong. listen and learn, reflect on that and move forward differently, hands aloft, acknowledging that there's room for improvement. Now, this approach does tend to prevent the outcome of being cancelled. The other capabilities now are, what do you need to know in order to respect and value the difference that you come across? How do you ensure everyone has access to information as you gather it? This is CQ knowledge. And because again, you can never know everything about everyone, I say this is why it's so important to surround yourself with a diversity of lived experiences. How do you plan for your interactions with others? What amount of time do you give your staff for adjustment? How do you check your assumptions? Are you aware of who you are and what you're bringing to the party, as it were? This is CQ strategy. How do you put these into action? Are there communication modes there so people can openly provide feedback, calling out issues and biases? How do we adapt in any given circumstance with those who are different from us? This is CQ action. And that's the foundational piece. Like I said, we then use this as a behavioral piece and overlay it with the McKinsey influence model of change, which is proven to be 8 times more successful at embedding change when you have all 4 cornerstones used rather than just one. So fostering understanding and conviction, there's clarity as to why the inclusive change is needed. People understand why they're being asked to make the change, and it makes sense to them. And there's also the data piece of work here, ensuring that we have robust tracking and monitoring coming in here. How your staff are developing their skills and talents. Are they getting the training they need to help them understand the change? They have the opportunity to behave in the new and inclusive ways. Appraisals, they have inclusive objectives baked into them, and they're supported and they're held accountable, preferably with support like the transfer of learning into action coaching that I mentioned earlier. Role modeling, people are more likely to change their behaviors and mindset if leaders and colleagues are behaving in a new way. And this is why it's so important to start with the absolute echelons of your organization, the senior CEO, executive, senior leadership. And are the policies and structures in place allowing us to reinforce with formal mechanisms, whether that's about recruitment, pipeline schemes, mentoring, clarity of vision, mission, organizational goals, policies? All of these need to have inclusion with CQ behaviors baked into them. When we implement this then at individual, team, departmental and organizational level across the 4 areas of the organization, we attract people into our businesses, how we educate them, how we treat and retain and progress staff, how we develop and deliver the services, and how we attract our users, customers, clients, members, etc. This is an intersectional approach where we're not just looking at race over there and disability over here and sexuality over there and gender over there. We're asking, what is it about me which means that I can find it difficult to work with you? And when we do that, we can really start to think about how we move forward. Now, I say that the language of CQ in itself is not confrontational, but the level of introspection required can be uncomfortable. And we need to practice and exercise our inclusion muscle to become stronger. And so it becomes easier. And the inclusive culture pyramid requires us to engage in a cognitive evolution so we can create procedures to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. All of this work, the model, each individual owning and taking personal responsibility for their role is a reason to have hope. We can achieve that tangible change. And the power of one is power multiplied indeed. And this message of hope that comes from the form of personal responsibility, I sometimes use Kamala Harris, which I've put in the white paper, or Martin Luther King. But to finish, I'd just like to revisit the words of Amanda Gorman and The Hill We Climb. She concluded, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country, our people, diverse and dutiful, we will emerge battered but beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. A new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Thank you for listening.
Marsha, thank you. I wish we were in a live room where people could erupt with applause in that. So thank you for that. And I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of questions about the conceptual information you shared and how you're actually doing this at RIBA. So we'll give you all an opportunity to ask some questions in a bit, and you can even start using the Q&A now, as some of you had. But before we jump to everyone else's questions, you and I have a lot of history together, so let's just have a chat a bit and kind of talk about who's the person behind all this great kind of model that you've laid out there. So when you and I first met, you were a journalist with the BBC. In fact, the vast majority of time that we've known together, you were with the BBC, and now you're leading diversity efforts with RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. Talk to us a little bit about your professional journey. How does one who was a journalist suddenly end up leading diversity efforts?
Yes, I had a 30-year career in broadcasting. In fact, December would have marked 30 years since I did my first live radio show. And I always wanted to work in radio, and it was all about me because I love the sound of my own voice. But I matured. And as I grew in my journalism, it became really, really important to me to that motto that I have for myself, giving the unheard voice a place to speak. So as a journalist, I was very much focused on going out in communities and without an agenda and listening and hearing different stories. And I try to encourage that methodology, not only in how we approach our audiences, but how we approach our content and how we approach the different ways we went about recruitment and everything else. And so in an effort to try to do this more, I set up my own inclusion consultancy a few years ago called Unheard Voice. And I developed this strategy with Unheard Voice. And when I saw the opportunity to work with the RIBA as a director of inclusion, I thought, I want that job. And the reason why I said I want that job is because architecture is so important in the way that we shape our lives. And it's so funny, I just went down to the kitchen. I'm here at the headquarters of 66 Portland Place, the RIBA in London. And there's a quote on this mug from Winston Churchill, and it says, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter our buildings shape us." And with architecture having that power to shape us, how important is it, therefore, that those buildings are inclusive so they can shape us in an inclusive way? And that is why I applied for this role, because architecture, our president, Simon Alford, described it as the backdrop to the theatre of our lives. And therefore, let me influence the creation of inclusive spaces and therefore change the world.
So much to unpack with that. And yeah, the theme of your life of giving voice to the unheard voices is something that I've gained so much from talking with you about personally and professionally throughout the years. I know even in your journalistic career, it was kind of, but how do we broadcast the voices that aren't getting heard? And you know, there's a lot of talk right now about the tragedy that's just happened to this young woman in the US who was found and presumed to potentially be killed by her boyfriend in a national park, and it's raised again the question of, but what about all the individuals who don't look like her, who go lost all the time, whose voices we never hear about, etc. So, but let's get even more personal. So. Yeah, we both use the "where are you from" video and joke about it in our training, but an unfiltered observer might look at Marsha and go, so are you British? Like, you don't look like what I thought about in terms of British. So talk to us a little bit about your own cultural identity.
I dare say I am British.
Okay, fair enough.
The observer is definitely unfiltered. Yes, I am British, although it's an identity that I have struggled with a bit, to be honest. And my parents are Trinidadian. I'm wearing red, white, and black today. Trinidadian colours, you. And you know, it's you know, when they were born, actually, Trinidad was a British colony, so they were born British and were brought up British as well. But I prefer to say I'm a woman of the world, because political lines drawn on maps aren't necessarily the way that I choose to identify myself. But yeah, Britain is a very mixed place with lots of diversity, racial diversity, and every other part, with the 60 million people in the UK. So yeah, people like me, people who don't look like me. And funnily enough, I like to use a statistic, because we think about Britishness maybe as being white, male, heteronormative, men based in London and the Southeast, as being certainly that demographic is the demographic that hold authority in the UK. But that demographic, white male, heteronormative, able-bodied, and based in London Southeast, only make up 3.1% of the UK population.
Wow.
So there is serious underrepresentation going on.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about RIBA. So you gave us this very compelling insight into the work that you've laid out, but you're really new at RIBA. It's 6 months. Help me with the...
just over 7 months now.
7 months. Okay. So you're now in your current role at RIBA, and we hear the passion behind it, but practically, like, where do you even get started with this? And for a lot of our attendees who probably don't have a clue what RIBA is, maybe just give us a quick snapshot, other than we know you deal with architecture, but what is RIBA, and where do you even begin with an organization that I happen to know from interacting with you is massive in terms of membership?
Yeah, so the Royal Institute of British Architects is nearly 200 years old. It's a membership organization. I feel like I need the corporate line here. my colleagues in RIBA marketing will say, Marsha, make sure you say this and that. The RIBA, let me make sure that I get this right. It's a global professional membership body. It serves its members and society in order to deliver better buildings, places, and stronger communities in a sustainable environment. And there are about 300 staff and 55,000 members globally. But the profession of architecture is known for being, you know, quite white, male, older, and the progression of underrepresented groups is something that I've been brought in to try to help with, because you've got a good mix of people wanting to enter the profession, but they're not necessarily entering it, and or dropping off at various stages. So that's definitely something that I'm looking at. And in terms of, well, in the first 7 months, what do? You've got this massive organization. How do you go about it? Well, you know, from day one, when I was doing my interview, I was like, this is the model, this is what I'd want to do, and this is how I'd like, you know, to do it. So if you're going to hire me, this is what I'm going to do. So I started with the exec team, a very engaged, very brilliant group of people who said, yes, Marsha, we're open to CQ. So we did the assessment. We did they did a workshop, a CQ workshop, leading the CQ workshop with me, and they've had the coaching as well, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a second. I did that again with the senior management team, another group of 40 people. And then I'm cascading to the rest of the staff, the CQ assessment and e-learning, and the coaching is coming in the form of an AI app that they're able to use to be coached through implementing their learning. Now, the transfer of learning into action coaching that I've also brought in to help implement the CQ learning has been crucial to bringing about actual change. It's put together by Emma Webber at Lever Learning, and she is a global leader in the transfer of learning into action. And what she says is that, you know, 20% of the time people don't implement what they learn in training sessions. The other 65% of people want to implement it, but they get back into the day-to-day and they just forget it. And that's 80 to 85% of what they call scrap learning. Now, I couldn't afford for that to happen with CQ. So I brought in Emma, and I want you to get some feedback actually from what Emma said, a reminder that she's a global leader in what she did, and she decided to keep her hand in and involve herself by delivering